Hello and welcome to the Boxing Insider. This week we're asking, where does Tyson Fury rank amongst the greatest heavyweights of all time?
Winning is the most important thing, and I think just beat like you said, beat Usyk, be unified champion, beat Joshua, beat all the top heavyweights, and retire undefeated, retire unified champion of the world. I think that'll really secure his place right at the top and in history.
We've never seen a heavyweight like Tyson Fury.
I think Holmes would have beaten him. I think Foreman would have beaten him. I think Frazier would have beaten him. I think Tyson would have beaten him.
Now, whilst we await fight news when it comes to Tyson Fury, it feels like a good time to look at the Gypsy King standing compared to the greatest heavyweights of all time. And we're going to do it in 4 different categories. We're going to look at records, longevity, era, and of course, head-to-heads. So when it comes to the Gypsy King's resume, 30 victories, just 1 draw, that come against Deontay Wilder. Many felt he should have actually won that fight. But how does his resume stack up compared to the best heavyweights of all time? Well, here's talkSPORT's Ade Oladipo.
So if we're being honest, in the last 6-7 years, we only are talking about 2 fighters, Vladimir Klitschko and Deontay Wilder. That's not enough for me. It really isn't. And look, I'll argue with anyone that says that's enough to kind of be in sort of the great all-time list. It really isn't. We've got to have longevity's got to be a discussion. And again, let's have a look at your CV. What have you done? That's got to be a discussion as well. It can't be a case of, okay, but I think he will beat him. That's far too easy then, because we can do that about everyone. It's got to be a case of open up that CV. Let's have a look at it and let's see what you got. And Joe Louis has got more. Evander Holyfield's got more. Lennox Lewis has got more. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Foreman, I can go on. They've all got a bit more than Tyson Fury. You chuck in a Usyk, a Joshua, a Dillian, Whyte, it's another discussion.
I put that same question to legendary boxing writer Colin Hart.
Fury's had 32 fights. It is not the number of fights that really matters. It's the men they fought and beat, the class of fighter they fought. And you'll find, if you go through the records of Ali, Holmes, Foreman, or the ones I've already mentioned, they met a very higher class of opponent throughout their career than Fury has had to do.
When you look at the fights that Fury's been in, you mentioned there taking on Wilder 3 times, taking on Klitschko, who was heading towards the end of his career. What would Fury need to do for you to put himself right in that conversation with the names you've mentioned?
Right, wave a magic wand and send him back 30, 40 years so he was in that particular era I've been mentioning. And then if he was in against those guys and he beat those guys, then I would say he's the greatest heavyweight who ever lived. He wouldn't, in my opinion, have beaten them. He would have given them good fights and given them a lot of trouble because of the sheer size. And he's a good boxer. He's got a good boxing brain. But would he have beaten Ali? No. I'm talking about all in their prime. Holmes reigned for 7 years. World heavyweight champion for 7 years. And they all fought the best that was around at that time. Now, Fury is beating the best that was around at that time, but the best ain't very good.
Right, it's time to look at how Tyson Fury's ability compares to some of the greatest heavyweights we've ever seen. And the perfect man to do that with is Bob Arum, who has promoted Tyson Fury and, of course, Muhammad Ali.
We've never seen a heavyweight like Tyson Fury, of the size of Tyson Fury, who can box the way he does, and yet has a really good punch and can knock out his opponent. I mean, that doesn't mean that smaller guys in the past couldn't be competitive with him.
Ben Davison trained Tyson Fury for that iconic first fight against Deontay Wilder.
Versatility is probably the most versatile heavyweight I've ever seen. Again, going back to that trilogy, in every fight you look, he performs completely different in every single one of them. It shows different attributes in every single one of them. So it's a tough man to try to work out how to beat when someone's so versatile, but yet so well-rounded in each area. So there's no heavyweight that's ever been that has an easy night for Tyson.
It's time to get the views of one of Tyson's training partners and former heavyweight world champion, Joseph Parker.
Oh, size, reach, and then just mentally strong and mentally tough. I've never been around anyone like him, to be honest. So it's and it's good. Rubbing shoulders and feeding off that energy, feeding off the confidence and the mental toughness which he has.
And in terms of the power, a lot of people speak about Tyson's boxing ability and the performance he put in against Klitschko in 2015 was obviously an incredible boxing display. But he did show in a couple of fights against Wilder that he does have power as well. How much power do you feel like he possesses? Is that something that sometimes we don't maybe talk about enough?
Yeah, listen, he's got power. He's 6'9", 260, 270 pounds. He's definitely got power. And even though it's not like, with the body sparring that we did, it's not like, oh, it is pretty hard. We go pretty hard, and it is. You feel a lot of those punches. He's got a lot of power.
Let's see what Ade's got to say.
Yeah, Fury's an incredible boxer, and I have to put my hands up. I never expected this at all from Fury. I remember when he fought John McDermott many moons ago, and I thought he lost one of those fights. So if you're going to tell me then that guy was going to go on to be arguably the greatest heavyweight of this generation, and in the discussion for one of the best of all time, I would have thought you were crazy. What he's done and how he's been able to reinvent himself as this really slick mover. He's a lot bigger than he used to be as well. But for some reason, he's able to carry that weight. But one thing no one really talks about is Fury's gas tank. It never runs empty. It's incredible. He's honestly got one of the best gas tanks for a guy that is 20 stone and 6'9". So when I do compare him to some of the greats of before, they would never have seen anything like this. Again, George Foreman was considered a massive heavyweight. You go back and watch the tapes and everyone's talking about Foreman versus Ali. They talk about Foreman like he's 8 foot tall. Fury would have dwarfed him. And that's how big Fury is. We know he can punch, he can box, he's got a chin, he's got heart, he's got everything to compete with the best. He really is an unbelievable boxer, and I didn't expect anything like this from Fury.
So how does this current era that we're in now compare to the great generations of yesteryear? Well, a man who has seen it all is Colin Hart.
Well, this is, again, the difference between the eras. Nowadays, because of the politics of boxing, these fighters are aligned to particular TV companies, whereas back to the golden age I'm talking about, they all fought each other. And now we've got this struggle. We've been waiting how many years for Fury and Joshua to fight? I think it's at least 5 years since Joshua first won the title. We've talked about him and Fury, and it still hasn't happened and may never happen. Whereas Ali fought Frazier 3 times, he fought Norton 3 times, he fought Foreman, he fought everybody. And that is the difference between the eras. So unfortunately, Fury is at a disadvantage for not being able to fight the best in his era, which allegedly is Joshua. I mentioned the champions who were around in the golden era. There were a lot of very good heavyweights as well. Bonavina, Jerry Quarry, Ernie Shavers. They were all world-class heavyweights. Today, at the moment, we're talking about 4 men. I mean, Wilder we must say, is off the scene at the moment. He may never fight again, who knows. But we're really talking about not 4 men, 3 men. We're talking about Fury, Usyk, and Joshua.
I think it's fairly safe to say that Colin is sceptical about this current era. But what does Ben Davison think?
This era is not done. We may have a Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua, may have a trilogy. May have a Tyson Fury, Dillian Whyte, may have another few fights of Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte, may have an Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. That's without mentioning Usyk mixed in along that. So when it's all said and done, I think it depends on if the guys have fought each other, no matter who wins. Boxing's boxing. Obviously, everybody, it means it's life and death wanting to win. But to say an era can match up with the era of the Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, those guys boxed each other. That's the most important thing. So when this era is said and done, if those guys have boxed each other, it matches up with any era it's ever been, in my opinion. But the important part of that is them obviously fighting each other.
There will always be a debate as to how Tyson Fury would get on in the ring head-to-head against some of these greats of yesteryear. And who better to ask than those that have witnessed all of these men in action down the years?
It's hard to see and it's hard to measure. In other words, how would Ali have done with a Tyson Fury? I mean, it's hard to determine that because Fury is so much bigger. What about George Foreman? Well, pretty much the same. Clear that Foreman had a more devastating punch than Fury, but Fury is so much bigger. And then what about Mike Tyson? I mean, Tyson is almost a foot shorter than Tyson Fury. And how does that work out if they had been in the same era and fought each other? I can't really come to grips with those issues. Luckily, I don't have to because those fights can't happen.
I would put him in the top 6, but at number 6.
And who's ahead of him?
Well, I told you, I think Ali would have beaten him. I think Holmes would have beaten him. I think Foreman would have beaten him. I think Frazier would have beaten him. I think Tyson would have beaten him.
Could anything convince you over the next 2 or 3 years that Fury could jump up that list?
Well, unless we had modern equivalent of the men I've mentioned, no.
So, how does Tyson Fury compare to some of the greatest heavyweights of all time? Well, I think it's so difficult to draw comparisons between eras and records, especially when you consider just how active some of these heavyweights have been down the years. When you look at Tyson Fury's ability though, his versatility, his powers of recovery, it's clear to see he's an incredible fighter. However, it's so difficult to determine what would happen if he was to step in the ring with some of these greats of yesteryear. I do think there is work for Fury to do though. If he was to beat Whyte, Usyk and Anthony Joshua, then surely Colin Hart would find room for him in his top 5 heavyweights of all time. Don't forget to check out our interviews in full and let us know what you think by leaving a comment below. Where do you think Tyson Fury ranks compared to some of the greatest heavyweights of all time? We'll be back next week with another episode of the Boxing Insider. But in the meantime, like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our boxing content across the talkSPORT network.